Inspirational Creatives, episode 282. Today, the Inspirational Creatives podcast is 5 years old, and I'm going to share with you the 5 ways that podcasting has changed my life. Welcome to Inspirational Creatives. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence. Join me every Friday as I chat with successful artists, producers, and creative entrepreneurs who share powerful stories and strategies. They can help you to create the life that you want. Listen each week as these inspirational creatives show you how to take your creativity to the next level. You'll learn how to create a sustainable business that inspires others and gives you the financial freedom and lifestyle that you want. Thanks for listening. Make sure you sign up at inspirationalcreatives.com to get free exclusive bonus material. And now, on with the show. Rob here, and a very warm welcome to this special episode of Inspirational Creatives. Yes, today, 5 years ago, in 2014, this Inspirational Creatives podcast first launched. And today, in this very special short action episode, I'd like to share with you the 5 ways that podcasting has changed my life in the last 5 years. Now, before we get stuck in, the first thing I want to say is a big thank you. Thank you to you for listening. This might be the first episode of Inspirational Creatives that you've ever heard, and welcome to the show. Maybe you've been listening since the very beginning. I know that some of you have, and I know that some of you have listened to these episodes, each episode more than once, which is incredible. No matter how Inspirational Creatives fits into your life, I hope that by listening, it's helping you to positively improve your life in some shape or form. Now, I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to be able to make the time, have the know-how, I suppose, and the people around me, the wonderful people around me, the very experienced and technical people around me, to help me get launched with this show way back when. And I've learned so much during that journey. I can't wait to share with you 5 of the noticeable things that have benefited me in terms of podcasting and having a podcast in my life. Although I haven't exclusively included this as one of the 5, having podcasts at all is an amazing thing, in my opinion. For me, these deep listening experiences, podcasts, are a wonderful way for us to be able to educate or entertain ourselves, regardless of where we are. I know that a lot of my listeners, you listening to me right now, you might be commuting, you might be cycling, walking, running, cooking, gardening, or maybe you're just sitting at home with a cup of coffee or tea, listening to this episode, listening to my voice right now. And that's one of the wonderful things about podcasts for me, is that we have this ability to curate our own content. We can go really deep into a subject, into something that means something so much to us, wherever we are, whenever we can find the time, of course. And I know that for many podcast listeners, what's exciting about podcasts is we can fit them into our lives. So when we have that daily commute, we know we've got 20 minutes, half an hour to listen to a podcast. And it's a really great way to use our time, I believe, because it creates leverage in terms of we might be on the way to somewhere. And during that time, it's not just a journey, it's also an opportunity to improve our lives somehow. And as I say, that could be entertaining ourselves, making ourselves laugh, or it could be educating ourselves in a subject, perhaps like on this podcast, where we want to explore an area of our life a little bit more deeply. Now, for me, this podcast wouldn't be possible without the wonderful coaches and mentors that I've had surround me during my 5-year journey with my own podcast. Of course, I've been producing podcasts for longer than that. But for my own podcast series directly, I can't thank those coaches and mentors, you know who you are, enough for the encouragement and guidance that you've given me putting this show together. Without doubt, somebody I would like to thank publicly on this podcast for enjoying the journey with me throughout the almost that entire life of this podcast over the last 5 years, and also for 2 amazing interviews which I've used several times in workshops at universities and colleges, is Steve Palfreyman from stevepalfreyman.com and the Music Launch Hub. Steve has been a weekly mastermind partner and collaborator almost every week, with very few exceptions, throughout the whole lifetime of this podcast. And it's his wisdom that's inspired me, certainly with my own motivation and consistency and direction with the podcast. I enjoy every single conversation I have with Steve. Every week he's just listened to me. I've hopefully listened to him with equal measure, and we've shared ideas, and there's not much we hold back in those private mastermind sessions that we have together. And certainly with Steve's help and encouragement, the shape, format and direction of this podcast have been heavily influenced by him. So my deepest thanks to Steve for his friendship and his commitment to our professional development. More than anyone, of course, I would like to thank my wife, Sandra, for her guidance, support and inspiration throughout the whole of this Inspirational Creatives journey so far. She's been incredibly patient, and I often refer to her as my secret weapon, solving complex problems in ways I wouldn't have imagined when it's come to putting this show together. My wider family as a whole has been a tremendous support, allowing me to do this. That's the first thing, because obviously putting a podcast together takes time away from other things, including, most importantly to me, my family. In fact, our youngest son was born not long after this podcast was launched in 2015. And I remember vividly putting together a short action episode together that morning, the morning that he was born, and soon after lunch he was born, no less. And what I'm grateful for is the lifestyle that I have around this podcast, and the lifestyle that this podcast has given me, where I was able to record this short action episode upstairs and our youngest son was born downstairs. The great thing is that as much work as putting a podcast is together, it hasn't really distracted me, I feel, from my family life, and those that are important to me, my children and my wife Sandra, tell me too that actually it is possible to achieve great things without compromising aspects of your life that are important to you. And as I mentioned, family time is incredibly important to me, and it's nice to have produced something so wonderful, a legacy perhaps, and something I'll talk about shortly, without creating any disadvantage to others. And this is really important, and the reason I'm sharing it with you is because what I do see occasionally in the world is that people will go above and beyond, which is fantastic, to create something magnificent like a podcast show or series. But I think sometimes there's a danger that we can let it compromise in other areas of our life. And that's been something that's been very conscious to me throughout this whole journey, is that despite my large aims with this show, I've never wanted it to interfere with my professional work as a coach and as an audio producer, but also my family life, which is incredibly important to me. So thanks again to all my friends and family and my coaches and mentors for making this series possible. And a special thanks to you, the listener, for listening, of course, and especially Sandra for being there always. With all of that in mind, I'd like to share with you now the 5 ways that podcasting has changed my life in the last 5 years. So number 1, without question, has been the people that I've met. I can't believe how podcasting and having my own show and series has allowed me to get access to people I otherwise thought unreachable. Now, there are many examples of this that spring to mind, but one particular example, Michael Port, was somebody I thought would be impossible to get onto the show because he's such a busy guy, such a high-profile guy in his particular industry, in our industry. And I was really surprised when I reached out to his team when he had a new book out that he was actually available and was delighted to be a guest on my show. Having been a fan of Michael Port's for many years and read his books, it was one of those turning points for me on the series where I suddenly realised the power of having a podcast and something like a podcast, which to some degree reminds me of the kind of respect that you get as an author if you publish a book. If you publish a book, people may not have read your book, but instantly you've got that credibility and people respect you in a certain way because you've actually gone through the process of putting a book together and putting a book out. And having a podcast seems to have a similar effect. In my mind, suggests to others that you're actually really serious about what you do. And of course I am. And this is a subject that I deeply believe in. So I was really surprised to actually see that power at work with some of the guests. Another guest I didn't expect to get on the show was Scott Stratton from the Unpodcast. Scott's a very funny person and I had a great chat with him. So I seriously recommend going and finding those 2 interviews. If you've already heard them before, go and listen to them again, because one of the great things about having your own podcast is you get to listen to your own content over and over again. And every time I listen to my own content, it always surprises me what I learn. There's a tremendous amount that I listen to, but I miss. And depending at what stage I am in my own journey, depends often what I'm listening to or what I'm hearing. And I think that'll be true for you too. I don't know about you, but there's this experience that I have when I read books. Sometimes I read the same book that I've read some 5 or 10 years ago, but it feels like a completely fresh, new and exciting book, probably because I'm at a different point in my life and all of a sudden the book is talking to me in a different way. It reminds me of a Zen quote, which is that no man steps into the same river twice, because both the man and the river have changed. So in that respect, one of the things that I really enjoy about having a podcast is not just the people I meet, but the ability to replay those conversations over again and learn something new from what they had to say way back when. Now, of course, I'm talking about the guests here, but really, actually, one of the most amazing transformations that I've experienced in my life by having a podcast is the people that actually listen to the show. And a great many number of those I've had the opportunity to have calls with, the opportunity to speak to them about how my podcast fits into their lives. For quite some time now, I've had as part of the newsletter subscription process, which is actually changing now on the podcast as to be revealed. One of the great things about that process for me is every time somebody subscribed to the newsletter, I invited them to jump onto a Skype call with me for 5 minutes. And a great number of listeners took that opportunity up. And those 5-minute calls ended up being 15, 20, 30, 60-minute calls in some instances. And it was lovely for me to be able to speak to people I still think about, those conversations I still heavily reflect upon from time to time, hearing about how this podcast fits into somebody else's life. And that's really important to me. Obviously, I'm producing this content, but I want to make this content useful. And I'm always sensitive to whether the content I'm producing is useful and whether it's provided in a format that makes sense to my listener. So through that process, I've met a great number of listeners to the show, and that for me makes the podcast very real. Whilst, yes, I see the download numbers when I'm uploading episodes, what's really exciting to me speaking to listeners is it's actually bringing those numbers to life. These are real people in real situations listening to this content. And with that in mind, one of the things that I often coach and train people about on the podcasting side of things is that podcasts are very much the beginning of a conversation. I think for some people, they think it's broadcast only. You create this content and you just put it out there and it's set and forget in that respect. But for me, it's very much about starting the conversation. So those conversations with Scott Stratton and Michael Port, for example, are actually the beginning of a conversation. And indeed, those interviews themselves have led to a great number of conversations that I've had with the listeners, and that's been a wonderful experience. What's exciting for me, hearing about how this content sits with somebody else in their life, is that I get to learn from them and they teach me a tremendous amount about myself. But what else I need to learn and what else we all need to learn as a collective community, which often informs the next guest on an episode, or if not the next guest, the set of questions that I might use with a future guest, because they've got expertise or experience in an area that we want to learn more about. So without doubt, the number one way that a podcast has changed my life has been the people that I've met. It's the guests, it's the other podcasters I've got to meet. Podcasters are wonderful people, and every podcasting community that I've touched upon, I've met some really incredible people. They inspire me. Listening to their conversations and their podcasts inspire me in ways that are ineffable. But it's also the listeners to this podcast that I meet and I get to talk to, because they teach me so much about me and about my own podcast too. The second way that a podcast has changed my life, having my own show and series, is I feel it's helped me to become a much better speaker. I wasn't actually that confident in terms of just putting myself out there, putting out my own ideas on any kind of public platform or stage, so to speak. Podcasts are very live for me, even though that the conversations are recorded and then they're edited and then they go out. The actual conversations, of course, are live. And for me, sometimes the more high profile the guest, so somebody like Michael Port or maybe Chris Brogan, I felt pretty nervous actually having those conversations. And in fact, even with the lesser known podcast guests, in fact, I've had a great number of podcast guests that my podcast has been the very first podcast interview that they've ever done. And that's been a great privilege. I've felt really nervous because you just never know how it's going to go. You never know where the conversation is going to take you. The technology is going to hold up. You hope that it does. There's a part of me that worries that I might say the wrong thing. And for that reason, it can be quite a nerve-wracking but exciting experience at the same time. These days, I try and sort of preempt the conversation somewhat by doing my research, of course, but also asking my guest, inviting my guest to let me know what's hot for them right now. So maybe this is a subject we could go deep into, but also checking with my guest, are there any particular areas that we shouldn't cover, perhaps? So that's allowed me to sort of put some processes and procedures around the way I approach my guests, but I don't like to be too rigid in terms of interviewing people. I like to follow my own curiosity, even though I might have a set of questions in mind about things I want to ask them about. That said, though, having done this stuff consistently, routinely, week in, week out, and having the enormous privilege of being a guest on other people's shows, even though I haven't been a guest on that many shows, it's given me the opportunity to think and talk about this subject matter in a number of different ways, which has sometimes led to public workshops. But I felt very confident with the material because, again, I think it's one of these opportunities, having a podcast, to talk about this stuff routinely, consistently, in small doses over a long period of time. And that's, without doubt, helped me become a much better speaker. The third way that having a podcast has changed my life has been the opportunity to be discovered, to be heard. So you might have some great ideas. And if you have got some great ideas, you might want to share those ideas. And a great way to do that, I believe, is through audio for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Generally, people that listen to podcasts are people that are looking to take their intelligence, their education, their know-how, their whatever it might be, they're looking to take some part of their life to the next level. And what's exciting about that is that I think we can all help each other. And having a podcast is not about being necessarily the person at the front of the crowd. It's being part of the crowd, certainly for me. And I think that's why it's really exciting, certainly for me, that a number of my peers have their own podcast or they have some kind of creative output, be it a blog or a video series, to express not only their ideas, but the ideas of others that they know, other experts, other people in their community, and they can share those ideas whilst infusing their own ideas with those ideas. And I think what's exciting about that for me is that then becomes a conversation. It becomes a collaboration. So when I say that podcasting has allowed me to be heard and it's given me a platform, it's given me a platform that feels natural to me. I mean, I don't mind being on video, but I much prefer to be behind the mic like right now, just chatting away, as many of my close friends know, sharing all that I've learned about a particular subject because I get excited about that stuff and I can't wait to share what I've learned. But one of the nice things about having a podcast is I was always in this situation meeting experts and I could never quite remember exactly what it was that they said or, you know, the number of steps or the sequence of the steps that they shared with me when I've asked them specific questions in terms of satisfying my own curiosity. Well, the great thing about having a podcast, of course, is it's given me an opportunity to record those conversations and to share those conversations as pieces of curated content. Now, for this series, and this was just a complete fluke, but I'm excited to say that a number of people have actually copied this format. When I launched the series, as those of you that listen quite closely to this series will know, every odd-numbered episode is an interview and every even-numbered episode is a short action episode. So if you're short on time and if you just want to cut to the chase, learn something that you can take action on in your life and make a difference to your life right now, you just need to listen to the even-numbered episodes. Now, the exciting things about those, of course, is they're also invitations to listen to the longer interview if you like what that person has to say. For me, as a curator and as an educator in that sense, and as a coach, these short action episodes have been a brilliant opportunity for me to share what I know, what I've learned from other people, whilst curating parts of those deeper conversations with those that I've interviewed. So in that way, it's given me an opportunity to be discovered as a coach and as a podcast producer, but it's given me a platform which feels natural to me. So this is a way I want to be discovered. This is a way I want to be heard in a format that I believe in and a format that I feel fits my personality and style. So without doubt, one of the great things about having a podcast in the last 5 years is it's given me a presence. It's given me some kind of body of work that establishes me in various different small ponds and says, here I am, this is who I am, and this is what I know and who I know. And if you're interested to learn more, please connect with me. So in that sense, it's also been great for credibility and developing trust with people to say, look, here I am. I'm not going anywhere. I'm hanging around. I believe in this stuff. And if you want to work or collaborate with me or even just have a conversation with me, here I am. You can learn more about me in a very safe and easy way without actually having to get to know me yet in person until you want to do so. Now, the fourth way that having a podcast has completely changed my life is quite closely related to some of the points I've already made just now. And this is to do with becoming an expert. Now, I wouldn't call myself an expert. I would call myself an explorer. I feel very much like a student. And this isn't a cliche. I really genuinely mean this, because you'll hear people say this, but this feels very real to me. Every day, I feel like I'm still beginning with all of this stuff, with podcasting, with the subject matter of this podcast, which began as creative entrepreneurship, but more recently is all about living creatively or having more creativity in your life, so that you're connecting with who you really are deep down at a soul level. So I feel a lot more expert at that subject than I did 5 years ago, without doubt, but I still feel like I'm really at the beginning of my journey, and every day is a fresh opportunity to learn something new. And that for me is incredibly exciting and does help me to jump out of bed. This truth, if you like, was revealed to me more recently when I've been doing workshops and people have asked me questions, and I realized that actually not that long ago, I wouldn't have had the answers to these questions, but now I have got the answers to these questions, or at least some of them, or I've got some idea of where we can start to answer those questions. And that's because of the number of people that I've already had the chance to interview and learn from those experts and those people with really deep experience. So what I've realized here is that to some degree, as I've interviewed those experts, it's developed my own experience, particularly as I've applied what they've taught me. And that experience in itself has helped me to learn something a bit more about this subject matter, which makes me a little bit more expert. Now, like I say, I wouldn't regard myself as an absolute expert. I don't think anybody is a complete expert in anything. But sometimes we can think of ourselves as experts if we're 20 steps ahead of somebody else. I don't mean that as soon as you learn something, you become an expert. I don't believe in that. But what I do believe is that if you learn something and you apply it, and you apply it consistently for a period of time over and over again, you gain experience. And that experience to some degree makes you more expert than you were before you had that opportunity to try out those things. So it's helped me to kind of hone my craft, if you like. Definitely my skills, my abilities, my know-how, what works for me, what doesn't work for me. I think it's worth pointing out at this point too that everything I've learned from the podcast series has been a bonus to me when I've been coaching or producing other people's podcasts, and when I've been coaching people with their lives, their careers and their business, because I've got experts who have taught me about different subjects and different points of view and different principles, tools and techniques and strategies. And what's been wonderful for me as a value add to my own client base, I've been able to point people back to these particular conversations, these interviews, these short action episodes, which reveal really key ideas that I feel can really make some kind of life-changing impact. The really nice thing for me is I'm able to share all of this wisdom freely to anybody around the globe that knows about this podcast and has reasonable internet access. So it's not just exclusive content for my own clients, which of course I'm able to further curate that content for my clients by pointing them at these particular conversations if they're unaware of them. But all of this information and this knowledge and these conversations are out there in the world, freely available to people that are interested in this type of thing. So in that sense, it's given me a lot of content with which to get stuck into, things to try, new ideas, new approaches. Morning routines is something that came up quite a lot in the podcast series so far. Experimenting with different ways I can set up my day to make myself more peaceful, more productive, more excited. And with all of that in mind, we do become more expert in our own lives. And having a podcast has definitely been an opportunity to develop my expertise. So the fifth and final way that having a podcast has changed my life has been the fact that it's given me a really deep sense of purpose. Now, I'm not somebody that's lived my life without purpose. There's probably been times where I've not fully understood the direction or the purpose of my life right now. But I've definitely found that having a podcast has given me a deep sense of purpose and meaning in my life, because it's given me something to build my life around, or rebuild my life around, so to speak. Having an ever-changing and consistent workflow and routine, i.e. the podcast each week, producing 2 episodes at times each week, has given my life a structure that I've allowed all my other activities in my life, including my family and my professional work, to work around. There's something to be said about enhancing your creative abilities and your creative output and your mastery of your craft with this aspect of discipline. And if you go back and listen to some of the more recent episodes, particularly those with Professor John Last and also painter John Link, you'll hear me ask about discipline. And it's fascinating what those two Johns have shared with me in terms of how discipline can really change your life and your ability to create a lifestyle which has structure, systems and processes, which I imagine any prolific podcaster will tell you are essential to podcasting. So it's given me a very deep sense of purpose. And certainly when I started to see people getting benefit from the podcast and I was starting to hear back from listeners, that's incredibly motivating to me. So it's given me a lot of meaning. One of the things that I haven't specifically talked about in this episode today is the fact that it's actually a legacy for me. One of the original intentions for me producing this podcast and this series was that it was to leave something behind for my sons and perhaps their grandchildren, who knows. One of the wonderful opportunities I feel that we have in this day and age that we live in is we're able to record these conversations in glorious 24-bit clarity, and we can leave this legacy content for future generations to enjoy. Now, I certainly don't see myself as an Isaac Newton or as an Albert Einstein, but imagine if you could hear their words in this clarity and actually have them express their own ideas through audio in this way. I think that would be an amazing, wonderful thing. And I think that's one of the great opportunities that we have here with podcasts, is to leave a really meaningful legacy. And the nice thing about having a legacy, of course, we won't be around in 200 years, but people might still be listening to your podcast or my podcast. One of the exciting things about that idea for me is it makes each day quite motivating, because if you know you're putting your heart and soul and your energy into something that has meaning or purpose, or could have this butterfly effect, positive knock-on effect to people around the globe right here, right now, but also in future generations, I think that's a wonderful thing to live for. So there you have it. They're the 5 big ways that having a podcast has changed my life in the last 5 years. Of course, there are many, many more ways, and hopefully I'll infuse those ideas in future episodes and teachings. But for now, if you're thinking of starting your own podcast, or maybe you've just begun the process of starting your own podcast, but you would like to learn more, feel free to reach out to me at robert@inspirationalcreatives.com. I'd love to help you on your own podcast journey for all the reasons that I've just mentioned. If they sound appealing to you and you want to live that kind of lifestyle, let me know. I would love to connect you to all the wonderful people and resources that I have in my own network that I believe can make a big difference to you on your own podcasting journey. Thank you so much for being a listener to this podcast and listening to this episode. If you've got this far, you've got 26 minutes into this podcast episode, you must be a dedicated podcast listener of sorts. I really appreciate you listening to the wider series too. Please go back and listen to some of your favourite episodes. One of the little tricks I like to do is go to the episodes tab on inspirationalcreatives.com and then do a search just on the page for a keyword and then see which interviews pop up. They can often lead to further inspiration and action and hopefully positive change in your life. If there's anything I can help you with, whether it's to do with your own creative pursuits, your own creative projects, creative entrepreneurship, or indeed podcasting, just let me know at rob@inspirationalcreatives.com. I'm not looking for business there directly. I'm looking to help you on your way. That was the whole point of launching this podcast. It was completely not for profit and still is to this day. It's out there. It's just an expression of, like I say, it's my purpose. I just feel I wanted to express some of these conversations that I was having in a rich and meaningful way and to create connections for you, the listener, in your own life. There's no reason why you can't create the same thing. Almost anybody can create a podcast these days, and I think that is a wonderful thing. I would love to hear your podcast, and I hope that your podcast is the beginning of a conversation too. If you're not interested in creating a podcast, but you just like listening to podcasts, thank you so much again for listening to the Inspirational Creatives podcast. I'm hoping to give you much more content over the next few weeks and months. I've got some exciting things lined up for you. I'm not going to spoil the surprise right now, but what you can do to celebrate 5 years of the Inspirational Creatives podcast is you can go to your favorite app store, your favorite smartphone app store, and search for Inspirational Creatives. And in there, you should find the Inspirational Creatives app, which is a really exciting way that I can share my content with you. You'll be pleased to know that unlike other podcast apps and even iTunes, which is now, of course, Apple Podcasts, You will not find every episode of Inspirational Creatives there. You will only find that on the website, inspirationalcreatives.com, and in the Inspirational Creatives app, where you can access every single episode that I've produced ever since 2014, November the 24th, 2014, 5 years ago today. You will only find that exclusively on the inspirationalcreatives.com website and in the Inspirational Creatives app. Now, if you download that app for free and you can listen to every single episode for free through that app, I will also in the very near future be offering you some exclusive bonus material, which may, I'm no promises here, but may include some video too. The reason being is I want to take this podcast and what I'm offering you here to the next level. I think there's more we could be doing. I've learned a lot in the last 5 years, and I realise that there are different pieces of information that you would like to receive in order to make your life better. And there may be more appropriate ways of the way I communicate that information or those conversations with you going forward. So connect with me there. I would love to hear what you think. If you do download the app and you give it a try, let me know what you think. It's in its early days at the moment. It's still in beta version. It's just being evolved, but I want you to be a part of that journey as you've been a part of this journey so far already. And I look forward to hearing from you. Remember, you can always reach out to me at rob@inspirationalcreatives.com or at rob_is_listening on Twitter. You'll also find me on Facebook and occasionally on Instagram under Inspirational Creatives, and I'll chat to you soon. Thanks for listening. Nothing beats the stories and advice of an expert to help you raise your creative game. I would love to know what you thought about today's episode, so don't forget to subscribe in iTunes, where you can rate and review the show. If you like this episode, I invite you to share it on Facebook or Twitter with the one person you know who will benefit from the wisdom shared here today. You can find the show notes on inspirationalcreatives.com/podcast. If you have a burning question or a great idea for a guest, head on over to inspirationalcreatives.com/contact, where you can connect with me there.